Okay, so Parshas Boy this week, we have the mitzvah. Obviously, we have the ending, the final plagues in the collection of 10 plagues. We have then the beginning of the Exodus, Hashem taking the Jewish people out of Egypt. And this event really is what we commemorate on Pesach. Pesach, the Pesach Seder is a commemoration of this event. And during the Exodus, at that point when Hashem's taking us out of Egypt, He did give a number of instructions, of mitzvahs, of commandments, one of which is to eat matzah. There are several mitzvahs that Hashem gave that go together. Pesach, there's the Korban Pesach, there's the mitzvah of eating matzah, unleavened bread, and maror, bitter herbs. The three mitzvahs are connected, combined, which is why in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, Hillel used to actually, the matzah was soft. Today we make matzahs crunchy like a cracker to be sort of extra careful to minimize as much as possible the chance that there might be some chametz in there or potential for something to become chametz. But hypothetically, you can bake a matzah that's, a quarter-inch thick or a half-inch thick, and technically it can be soft and it can be like a lafa. You could technically make lafa that's not only kosher for Pesach, but actually legit matzah to use at the Pesach Seder. And once upon a time, that's the way it was. And one of the things that we do at the Pesach Seder is we have koirech. Koirech means roll, to roll up. And we say, Kein asa Hillel. So did Hillel do in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, because these mitzvahs of Korban Pesach, the matzah, and the maror all to commemorate the Exodus from Egypt, he would do them together. He would take the matzah, which was this round, soft, basically like a lafa or a wrap. He would put the Pesach, Korban Pesach, he would take meat from the Korban Pesach, put it in this bread, and maror, bitter herbs, put the meat and the maror together, roll it up, koirech, he would roll it up, and basically he would make not just a Pesach sandwich. He would make a fresh roast lamb wrap with horseradish. That's what he did, right? So these three mitzvahs are connected. They have a deep connection. They're all part of this commemoration. Now, they're not all equal. No, all good. These mitzvahs are not all equal. Especially today. So today, the Korban Pesach, we don't do at all. There's no mitzvah to do Korban Pesach. Obviously, we can't. It's not an option. All we can do is commemorate the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. Which is the Afikomen, etc. We have maror, we still have a mitzvah to do today, but it's midrabanan, it's rabbinic. Matzah is the only one of these three mitzvahs that we actually have a scriptural mitzvah d'oraisa, to do today. So the mitzvah of matzah obviously is the highest priority, and in a sense, let's say, speaks the loudest to us of these three mitzvahs. In a sense, it has a particular prominence in this role of the commemoration and being a part of the Exodus from Egypt. Right, so we talked last week about Exodus from Egypt, the exodus from our constraints, our boundaries, the things that holds us back, the things that restrict us. Matzah is the only mitzvah d'oraisa we have today that's left of those three at that level. Let's have a look at this mitzvah and see, does it have something that's particularly relevant and important and impactful to teach us about the commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt, about going out from our limitations, breaking free, and really becoming everyone and everything that we are here to be and that we can be. So the question is, the most fundamental of all, if we want to talk about the lessons and the message of matzah, what is matzah? Matzah is unleavened bread, right? Bread that did not rise, bread that has not risen. Technically, you can make matzah, again, it doesn't have to be cracker thin, it can be thicker, but it cannot have risen. What does it mean when dough rises? Now, if you mix flour and water, there will be some degree of rising automatically even without adding yeast. There are things naturally in the grain that's going to make that happen, but to a very limited degree, right? Why do we add yeast or sourdough to dough? To make the bread softer, fluffier. It tends to, most times, be considered more enjoyable to eat. If you have a bread that's really soft and fluffy rather than a bread that's heavy and hard and it didn't rise properly, there's a big difference. How does the bread get softer? What does it mean that it's getting softer? And how does the yeast do that? I mean, sourdough ultimately also has some yeast in it, but it's yeast that's been developed naturally rather than added, which comes with a whole, different profile of texture and flavor and probably nutritionally also, etc. But either way, yeast are living organisms. Yeast are microbes. Like every living organism, it has a metabolism. It needs to consume nutrients so it can break them down to obtain energy, and there's a byproduct that's given off in the process. When yeast, and this is why a lot of times you have a recipe when you start making a yeast dough at the beginning, a lot of times there's sort of the recipe will tell you to do this proofing process at the beginning. For a few minutes you add some yeast, some warm water, maybe some of the flour, some sugar, something like that. And what do? You let it sit for 10 minutes and see whether you see bubbling. Why do you need to do that at the beginning? You don't need to, but why is it often recommended to do that at the beginning? Because if you have a jar of yeast sitting in your fridge and it's been there for a year, and those yeast died 6 months ago, and you put them in, and you wait 5 hours and your dough's not developing at all. Why? Because the yeast are dead. Right? So you do that proofing process at the beginning just to confirm, to see that it's bubbling, that it's alive, the yeast is still alive. That's why you do that at the beginning. So yeast are living, and very often it'll say to add just a little bit of sugar, a little bit of honey. What are you doing? You're putting in carbohydrates and a living organism. That living organism, the yeast, metabolizes the carbohydrates, metabolizes the sugar the same way that we do. The same way that our body will produce when we metabolize sugar. Sugar is a carbohydrate, carbon and water. The molecules get broken down, rearranged. The yeast do the same thing, and when they do that, when they metabolize that sugar, they break it down, they effectively eat it and use it to fuel their metabolism. They produce carbon dioxide gas as a byproduct. That's what those bubbles are. Those bubbles are the byproduct of the yeast metabolizing the carbohydrates in the dough. Now with sugar, you get a very quick response. It can metabolize quickly and easily, and you get bubbles within a couple of minutes. Once you see the yeast alive, you add in all the flour and you mix it and you knead it and you get it moving. And then, you might have to wait a half hour, an hour, a couple hours overnight, depending on the kind of dough. And what you're doing is, it takes more time to release energy from a more complex carbohydrate. So now the yeast have metabolized the flour. They're mixed throughout the flour, throughout the dough. They're metabolizing, they're breaking down, literally eating carbohydrates from the dough, producing CO2, producing carbon dioxide gas. So you have, throughout the dough, you have these little yeasts that are producing carbon dioxide gas. So what happens is the dough now has these tiny little bubbles of gas that are being produced inside the dough, and so the dough it rises, it becomes larger. How does it become larger? If you start off with a dough that weighs 3 pounds, and then you let it sit, and you come back, you let it sit in a warm, moist room, and you come back 2 hours later, and the dough is 3 or 4 times the size and weighs 3 or 4 times as much, it's like, hang on, what happened? No one added anything into the bowl, and this dough went from being 2 pounds to being 5 pounds. It went from being a half a gallon in size to being 3 gallons in size. Where did the extra dough come from? Did the flour just... No, the actual amount of dough technically is the same. The amount of flour is the same. The amount of water incorporated into that dough is the same. It's just that it has now been filled up with air. So the dough contains air within it, so it's now larger because it has air. It has these bubbles of carbon dioxide throughout it that make it just become larger and larger and larger because the yeast are for every molecule of carbohydrate they break down and release several molecules of carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide, it goes from being a solid to a gas, which takes up more space. And so the dough becomes larger and larger. And as it becomes larger, because it's being filled up with these tiny little pockets of air, it becomes softer, it becomes lighter. And that's why handling dough can become delicate. You don't want to let your dough rise, for 3 hours before you braid it, if you're making challah, for example. As you handle it, you kill the bubbles get squashed, the whole dough can collapse, and you end up with nothing. Or you let it rise again, depending how much yeast it has and how much it's got left in it. But when a dough rises, what's happening is, literally, it's just being filled up with what's effectively empty spaces. The yeast's job, and this is the reason we put the yeast in, is to create a bunch of little empty spaces in the dough. The dough gets larger, it gets softer and fluffier because it has lots of empty spaces in it. So matzah is just the flour and the water. You put in flour and water, you bake it, and what you get out is what you put in. Chametz, leavened bread that has risen, if you can start off with 2 batches of dough, the exact same. Now again, if you don't add any yeast, the amount that it rises is going to be minimal, negligible, but it will rise somewhat. But let's say you make 2 doughs with yeast. You make a challah dough, a recipe of a yeast dough, and before you knead it, you mix everything together. As soon as it's mixed, before you knead, because the knead really kickstart the development of the yeast and the development of the dough, you make a dough, you mix the ingredients. As soon as they're mixed homogeneously, you stop mixing, you cut the dough in half. You take half of it and you put it in the fridge or the freezer, and you take the other half and you just let it sit on the counter for 2 hours in a warm kitchen. You come back 2 hours later and you look at the 2 halves of the dough. They started out identical. The one that's in the fridge or the freezer hasn't changed, not because it's frozen, but because the temperature dropped, so the yeast are sleepy, they're not very active, so the dough's not rising. And the other one got much larger. Same exact ingredients. Just one of them now filled up with a bunch of empty space. So it became bigger than it's really supposed to be. This amount of flour plus, let's say, I don't know exactly what the ratios are offhand, but let's say you start off with a half a pound of flour and a half a pound of water. What's the mass of the dough going to be? 1 pound. Half a pound plus half a pound equals a pound. You introduce a sprinkling of yeast into there and mix that in. Now your 1 pound of dough over time will become 2 pounds and 3 pounds. The reason it got bigger, technically, if you would dissect it, and you could just literally squash it down, push out the air, you'll see it's still going to be 1 pound. But before you squash it down, after it rose, you weigh it, and it now weighs 2 pounds, 3 pounds, 4 pounds, whatever it is. So the dough, the way that the dough is perceived, the way that the dough presents, and the way that the dough is experienced is as a much larger dough than what it actually is. The moment you remove all those empty spaces, you see the dough for what it actually is. Boom, you take a dough, you come into someone's house who just prepared their challahs, they let them rise, they're ready to go in the oven, you walk up to the challah and you just go boom and squash it down. In addition to the black eye that you might get, you're going to see that challah was mostly air. And once you remove the empty space, you're back to this tiny little bit of dough. So while that dough had risen and it was full of that air, it looked bigger. Now the challah is that big. If the challah rises to be this big, then the challah is that big. But the dough looks like it is more than it actually is, because that's not all dough. I mean, you could call it dough, but it's really dough plus a lot of air inside, which is now part of the dough, fair enough. So when bread rises, it fills up with empty space, which makes it seem larger than it really is, more prominent than it really is. And this is what chametz represents. People would use the word ego. I don't love the word ego for a number of reasons. It's not wrong. But and that's actually, the Gemara says, there's a point, it says that one of the Amoraim used to pray, and he would say when he finished davening, he would say, Hashem, creator of the, master of the universe, you know, it is known and revealed before you that our will is to do your will. What is it that gets in the way? If our will is to do your will, then why don't we? Because Hashem knows we don't all always do Hashem's will. And anyone who looks in the mirror, honestly, is going to know that too. Why don't we? And he continues, says, "O mi ma'akev, who is it that gets in the way? So'er shebe'isa, the leaven in the dough." It's not us, right? People will talk about, stop getting in your own way. We get in our own way. That kind of is true, but it's not actually true. It depends on what you mean by you, right? When you look at that dough, you can say, there is, let's say, 3 pounds of dough in that challah. Or you could say there's, and again, whatever the numbers are, I don't know, but I'm making it up on the spot just for the sake of argument. It's a half a pound of dough plus 2.5 pounds of air incorporated into it, giving you 3 pounds. Well, that kind of is part of the dough. It is, and it's not. Depends how you want to define dough. So when we say, we get in our own way, we are the primary thing that stops us from being everyone and everything that we're here to be and we can be and should be, it is us, but it's also not us. It's the Se'er Shebe'isa. It's the leaven. It's the empty space that's incorporated into us that makes us present as more than we are. That makes us feel like we are more than we are. Every one of us has the infinity of Hashem inside of us. Every one of us has an irreplaceable role to play in the universe, in the purpose of existence, in the integration of divinity into the world, the realization of Hashem's desire and purpose for creation, and that's why every one of us is here. At the same time, the moment that if we get filled up with empty space, it's empty. There's nothing of value filling it up. And we start to see ourselves as being larger than we are in context. Me, it's about me. The moment that a person becomes self-centered and sees the world as revolving around themselves, we could call it arrogance. I think self-centeredness is probably a better, more precise term for what we're talking about, but they both work. That's the moment that things start going wrong. Any person, if any of us would hypothetically have no inflated sense of self, there would be none of this self-centeredness that is just empty space lacking anything of value and meaning. If we didn't have any of that, we would be perfect. We would do exactly what we're supposed to do every second of every day. But that's not the way we're created. We're not created, at least, to be like that naturally. We are created with a part of ourselves that does have a tendency to inflate, to rise, to fill up with empty space, devoid of meaning, to see ourselves as being larger than we really are, more prominent than we really are, to make us take up more space than we're really supposed to occupy. And that's the beginning of everything bad, everything wrong. And so matzah is the one mitzvah d'oraisa, the one thing that we do at the highest level as a scriptural commandment today, commemorating Pesach, because this is in some ways the most fundamental message of all. And that is, this is like fine print, but it's extremely important. For some people more than others. But for many, probably for everyone it's important. For some people it's like, can make the difference between, going in a very healthy direction or going in an extremely unhealthy direction. And that is not confusing confidence and self-awareness with arrogance and self-centeredness. They are not the same thing. There is nothing healthy about thinking that we are less than we really are. I'm so stupid, I can't do anything, or I'm not important, I don't matter. First of all, that's kfirah. That's denying the correctness of Hashem's judgment, because none of us would be here if Hashem wasn't making us be here. So if Hashem is making me be here, that means that I do matter. That means that I am important. That means I do have something unique and irreplaceable to offer that the universe needs, that Hashem needs, that we the people need, that Torah needs, that all other 8 billion people in the world combined could not have done without me. Because if that wasn't the case, I wouldn't be here. So to say that I don't matter or I'm not important is, in addition to incorrect, it's almost idolatrous. It's saying, I know better than Hashem. Hashem made a mistake when he created me. So first of all, saying I'm not important, I don't matter, is just flat out wrong. It's wrong empirically, it's just objectively incorrect. It's also wrong because it's a denial of Hashem's correctness. And it's wrong behaviorally and effectively, and in terms of health, right? In terms of health, if a person doesn't think that they matter, that's not going to be good for them. It doesn't end well for anyone, ever. And in terms of our ability to show up and to be everything that we're supposed to be, if a person feels like they don't matter, they're not going to be very motivated to try hard, are they? No, because they don't think it matters. And you know what? Every one of us has something unique to offer that the universe needs, that Hashem needs, that we all need, that Torah needs. But you know what else is true? Being that person and contributing, making that contribution, guaranteed, takes effort. It takes hard work. And a person will only ever put in a lot of effort if they feel sufficient motivation to do so. If a person doesn't believe that they matter, they're not going to feel motivated to put in the effort that's necessary to do great things, to become a great person, to leave a mark, to create a legacy, to make a difference. It doesn't, so people think, oh, I am going to be holy and I'm going to connect to Hashem, and therefore connecting to Hashem means not being arrogant. So I'm going to say, oh, I don't matter, I mean nothing, I'm stupid, I have nothing to offer, whatever it is. So you're not helping Hashem. You know what? Hashem has something that he needs from you, and if you're too busy putting yourself down and thinking that you don't matter, and therefore killing any motivation that you might have had to actually do the things Hashem wants from you, you know what? You haven't helped Hashem. Hashem put you here for a reason, because there's something the world needs from you. And to make that happen, you've got to show up, you've got to be motivated, and putting yourself down doesn't help. So no, putting ourselves down is not holy, it's not sacred, there's nothing positive about it. Humility doesn't mean putting ourselves down. Humility means not overinflating ourselves with empty spaces devoid of meaning. Right? If you make one recipe of dough that has 2 pounds of ingredients and one recipe of dough that has 4 pounds of ingredients, before they start rising, the second dough is bigger than the first dough. It has 4 pounds rather than 2 pounds. That's true. There's double as much value in that second batch of dough. There's double as many ingredients, double as much actual dough. It's only when it's filling up with empty spaces devoid of dough, these empty spaces, that now it becomes chametz. Right? If you make a 1 pound recipe of dough and you let it rise until it's 3 pounds, oh, that's chametz. Oh, so if you have 3 pounds of dough, it's chametz. See, if I make a 3 pound recipe and immediately bake it, is that chametz now because 3 pounds of... No. A dough that started out as 1 pound and filled up with empty spaces until it became 3 pounds, that's chametz. A dough that's 3 pounds of ingredients is not chametz until it becomes more than 3 pounds because it filled up with empty space. A person can and should be aware. Being self-aware is important. It's valuable and it's positive and it's constructive. It's correct. It's accurate. It's true. Every one of us has strengths. Every one of us has gifts. Every one of us has things to offer. And there is nothing noble about denying that or being unaware of that. It's not noble. It's not true. It's a lie. It's destructive. Being aware of our gifts puts us in a position to make the most of them, and that's why Hashem gave them to us. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, it says in the Torah that he was the most humble person who ever lived. Hang on a second. He was in a league of his own when it came to prophecy. There was no one who ever did or will have the level of prophecy, the depth of prophecy that he had. No one will ever be able to teach Torah like he did. What was he like, deluded? Did he not know who he was? How was he humble? It's like, no, that's not the way humility works. Humility doesn't mean thinking lowly of yourself. Humility means not filling up with empty spaces devoid of value and meaning. The things that make the bread soft and fluffy because it's empty space. Be aware of who you are. Be aware of your gifts, be aware of your strengths, and be proud and be confident. But don't fill up with empty space. And that's what happens when we become self-centered, when we focus on ourselves too much. Right? What does self-centered mean? When we say someone is self-centered, it means that as in their perspective, they are the center of the universe. They're self-centered. Everything is about me. You know what? I have news for you. It's also all about each of the other, 8 billion people in the world. And it's also all about every blade of grass and every molecule and every atom. It's like, sorry to disappoint you. That both is and isn't true, because if any one of us didn't have something unique to offer that the universe needed, that Hashem needs, they wouldn't be here. Which means that everything is also all about that person. But it's both. Right? And the person who has a correct, accurate perception of themselves and of the world will be aware of who they are and what their strengths are and their gifts and what they have to offer and the mark they can make in the world, with a very clear, with a clarity in the fact that all of that is because that's the way Hashem made them, and Hashem made them that way for a reason, and they are part of a big picture. They're part of a big tapestry that has a purpose and have a meaning. And yes, every one of us has an integral role to play in that. And when we see both of those together, we're not self-centered, we are purpose-centered. Now, every one of us is a part of that purpose, so there's no reason, if we're purpose-centered, there's no reason to dismiss ourselves or put ourselves down, because we are part of that. But we're going to see ourselves within that context. We are part of the purpose, part of the picture. Now, that also does go a step further, because the bottom line is, on one hand, I'm a part of this picture, and you, and you, and you, and every one of us is a part of this picture. And this becomes a very delicate balance in reality, figuring this out and weighing it up and knowing what to do. But on one hand, it means, you know what? Yeah, there's no reason why I should be putting myself before someone else. If I really appreciate clearly that everything I have and am and am here to do is because it's part of this picture that Hashem created, anyone else who has a role to play is equally important. There's also a time and a place to recognize the fact, and it's to a degree it's always, but that we also have different responsibilities. And every one of our responsibilities is primarily the things that Hashem puts on our plate. Right? And you see this, let's say, for example, when it comes to charity. Tzedakah, charity, is a good thing, is a noble thing. Is it noble for someone who has a family to give their entire paycheck away to charity to feed hungry kids in Africa, and then their own children at home are going to be cold and hungry because they can't afford to pay for heating or food because they gave away charity? Well, maybe, like, we're all people. It's like, but yes, we're all people and we're all part of it. But you know what? Every one of us has specific things that rank higher up in our list of responsibilities. And our own life, our own home, our own family, the things that show up on our own plate are the things that are our primary responsibilities. So there is a time and a place and a context for putting the things that are a part of my life before someone else's. There's also a part of the picture which is that I'm not actually any more important than someone else. And if the reason I'm putting myself before someone else is not because I have a clarity in the fact that Hashem made this higher up on my personal list of responsibilities, but because, well, I just care about myself more, that's a whole different conversation. Right? But ultimately, chometz is filling up with empty spaces devoid of content, devoid of meaning, devoid of value. Perceiving ourselves as bigger and more prominent than we are. Our whole vision gets obscured by ourselves because we've become this soft, big dough that's so inflated that we can't see past ourselves. That's a problem. Matzah, what you see is what you, not what you see is what you get, but what you see and what you have is all 100% real content meaning. There's no empty spaces. It's just actual flour and water. It's 100% objective, truth, accurate, real content and of real value. And the more we have an accurate perception of ourselves, and again, this includes a accurate, healthy self-awareness and awareness and appreciation of our gifts and talents and the ways that we're special and the things that we have to offer. But seeing it objectively, rather than in a way that's self-centered, where we start to take up more space, that's matzah. Matzah doesn't mean anything less than 100% self-awareness and confidence. Those things are healthy. As long as it's the matzah kind of self-awareness and confidence and pride, not the chometz kind. It's going to be 100% based on truth, on actual dough, on meaning, on value, on content, on truth, rather than filled up with empty spaces that just make it feel bigger and softer than it really should be if it didn't fill up with empty space.
So why on Shabbos do we need this extra bread? The extra space in the bread? Like why we praise
Well, on Shabbos we don't necessarily need extra space in bread. It could be matzah. You could have 2 matzahs on Shabbos.
Why we used to do?
Okay, so it's a good question and it's important, but I also want to finish this up first, and if there's time, we'll come back to it, okay? So we have matzah. Now, this is going to be a bit out of order, but right, versus, let's say, chometz. Chometz, matzah. Almost the same word. The difference is that chometz has a ches. Okay, that's not very correct way of drawing it, let's say. Chometz has a ches, and matzah has a hay. Aside from that, they're the same. Chometz and matzah, same flour, same water. One of them is just filled up with empty spaces. And that's the source of all the problems. So it's not us that gets in the way, it's the empty space that gets in the way. And we're going to see what does that look like and what it leads to and how that works in the structure of the letters, right? So they're almost the same. Ches has 3 sides. It's closed on 3 sides with an opening. And this opening, Pasuk Hashem is talking to Adam Rishon. Then there's the Pasuk Hashem says, "Lepesach chatos rovetz." At the opening, sin is crouching and awaiting, right? At the end of the day, we're all human. We all have our weaknesses. We're all fallible. And sin, negativity, the Yetzer Hara, is always trying to find a way in. And you know what? Let's just say that it's inevitable that it's going to find its way in. Negativity is going to find its way in as long as someone is a living, fallible, imperfect human being, which is perfect because that is the way we're supposed to be. Negativity can find its way in. All right, now, has anyone ever, let's say you get a can of olives or pickles or something, juice, whatever it is, and you maybe punch a hole in the top because you want to strain out the juice before you open it. You punch a hole in the top and you try to pour out the juice and it's like dribbling out and coming out really slowly. If you punch a second hole in the top of that can, what happens? Juice comes pouring out. Now, the hole that the liquid is coming out from might be, a half-inch in diameter. It's a pretty big hole, but it's still only dribbling out. And the second hole that you make just might be a little punch. You just punch a little hole, but that little hole makes all the difference to how quickly the juice can come out of the larger hole. Why? Because now you have the ability for flow. You can have air that makes its way in that little hole, which allows the fluid to make its way out. Right? And if you don't understand that, it seems like doesn't seem to make sense at all. You punch this big hole, And somehow through the big hole, the fluid's just like dribbling out slowly. And then you punch a tiny little hole. Now all of a sudden it comes out quickly. It's not, and the reason it works that way is because what you need is flow. You need two different places, one where it can come in, one where it can go out. And if you have those two different places, you can make the hole where the juice, the liquid is coming out from a quarter of the size or a tenth of the size, and it's still going to come out much faster if you punch a second hole than if you have a much larger hole for it to come out without punching a second hole. When we have two openings, one inlet and one outlet, then you can get flow and movement. You don't have stasis. The hay, the opening at the bottom is the same for the ches and the same for the hay, same for the chometz, same for the matzah, because you know what? You can be all the matzah that you want. You're still human. There's going to be negativity working to make its way into your life, and it will. Let's just be real. That's a fact. We can get better at it and maybe have less of it. And as we make progress, that which classifies as negativity for us becomes, less and less negative. Right? The things that we struggle with at the beginning of our journey, if we work on ourselves honestly and in a real way and consistently, for even a month, let alone for a year or 5 years or 10 years, you look at yourself 10 years later, it's just like, oh my goodness, the things I was struggling with 10 years ago, it's like, that's so far removed from my life. Now, I still struggle as frequently with as many things, but the kind of thing I'm struggling with is a little different. So we're always going to struggle. That doesn't mean there's no progress. But when we are matzah, when we're not self-centered, it's not about me. It's about Hashem. It's about the purpose. It's about the bigger picture. It's about this bigger picture that we are all a part of. And yes, my primary responsibility is myself and that which is on my plate, but only because Hashem said so. Ultimately, as far as I'm concerned, of my own accord, I should be viewing everyone as equally important and as much of a priority, because that's the truth. When we're a matzah, the negativity is going to make its way in. But you know what? We also have that little opening up here, which means that that which comes in can also make its way out. When we're not self-centered, when our view and perspective of ourselves and reality and our part in reality and our part in that bigger picture is accurate, and it's not filled up with empty space that overinflates and creates self-centeredness and all of those things, when it's accurate, then we are in a better position to be objectively aware of our shortcomings and where that negativity is. We can recognize it, we can acknowledge it honestly and in a way that's correct and adds up. And you know what? It's fine. We all have negativity in our lives. I mean, does Hashem have negativity? No. So you know what? We're not Hashem yet. And yet meaning ever, obviously. So we're not Hashem. We're not perfect. Okay, and that's not a bad thing. It's just the way things are. But if we are somewhat objectively, our perspective is, somewhat objective and we're more matzah than chometz, the negativity makes its way in and we notice it, we're aware of it, and we do what we can to correct it. The same way it makes its way in, there's a second opening so it can also make its way out. But if we're chometz, where out of this 4 pounds of dough, only 1 pound of it is actual dough and 3 pounds of it is just empty space, and the way that we perceive ourselves is way out of proportion to, or our prominence and centeredness in the picture is way out of proportion with who we really are and why we're really here relative to the picture and relative to everyone else. Now what happens is, negativity makes its way into our life, and what do we do when we're self-centered? We have every excuse in the book, and you know what? There might be good excuses. First of all, we have justifications. Really, that bad thing's a good thing because of such and such. And when we can't manage to come up with a justification that we can convince ourselves of, then we have excuses. And sometimes if we can't come up with a justification and or an excuse, denial. We just don't see it, we block it out. It's a very natural thing, and we all do all of these things to some degree. Right? But the more self-centered we are, the more chometz we are, the more we do those things because we're self-centeredness, we're missing that opening that can allow the bad to make its way out the same way it made its way in. When we're self-centered, the negativity that comes in gets stuck because we deny it, we excuse it, we justify it, and then it's going to sit there and it's going to ferment. And it's just going to escalate more and more and more and more. If we're matzah, there's no empty space, and every part of who we are is real, actual dough. Our perspective is accurately informed and it's correct and it's wholesome. And yes, we're self-aware and confident and proud and all of those things, but in a way that's accurate and not filled up with empty spaces. If we're matzah, then that hay has a second opening, and you know what? We're not perfect. Things will make their way in. But if we are accurately informed and we see ourselves with a healthy perspective, and our pride is a healthy pride, and our self-awareness is a healthy self-awareness, and our confidence is a healthy confidence, we'll look at that negativity that makes its way into our life. We can look at it relatively objectively, obviously never entirely objectively, but we can be honest about it, and then we can confront it and deal with it, and it can make its way out the same way it made its way in. And here we see that the message of matzah here is so important and so fundamental, and the impact is so universal. There is nothing that can happen in a person's life that they cannot do something about, to correct, to heal from, to improve, to repair. As long as a person is still alive and conscious, it doesn't mean that things are going to go away. It doesn't mean that the past is going to be erased. It doesn't mean there's not going to be a lasting impact. But as long as we're honest and our perspective is healthy, and we are self-aware but in a healthy way, and confident but in a healthy way, everything that makes its way in can still make its way out. The moment we become chometz, the moment we become self-centeredness, and that opening gets closed and we become a ches, now we're stuck. And the negativity is going to pile up and pile up and pile up and pile up, because that opening's there and it's going to keep on pushing its way in, and it's not going to stop. And if it's full, it'll just push its way in with a plunger and it'll just build up the pressure. It's not going to stop. That's life, fact. And it's not like it's either or. A person is either chometz or matzah, right? There are levels, and it's something we can work on. And if we feel like we are chometz, and all of us are chometz to a degree, and you know what? We work on it. We work on informing our perspective so that our perspective and the way that we view things is a little bit more correct, a little bit more accurately informed, a little bit more healthy, a little bit more wholesome, a little bit closer to the truth. And every bit of progress we make, we become a little bit less self-centered, a little bit healthier, a little bit better equipped to acknowledge the things that are negative and to be able to deal with them somewhat. And it's a never-ending ladder of progress. And we could look at that in two ways. A person could say, well, look at that, I'm never going to get there. It's like, well, what's there? There is no there. The bright side is, as much progress as you've made, you can always make more. There's no limit to how much more you can improve, how much more we can improve our perspective, how much more kosher lePesach we can become, how much we can become less self-centered, more accurately and healthily and wholesomely informed, and therefore, as a result of which, our confidence and pride and self-awareness becomes healthier and more wholesome and more correct, and we become better at cleaning house. That opening gets stays there, and we maintain that opening, and it grows in a sense, and we get better at cleaning house and getting rid of those negative things. And it's like it's a self-perpetuating phenomenon where, as we make progress and become a little bit less chometzdik, we will become better at seeing things in a way that's less subjective and less self-centered, which will enable and empower us to be able to make more progress, and then that will just keep on feeding itself again and again and again. It's not going to feed itself, but it keeps feeding into itself. As long as we continue to work, the progress will, and the progress isn't necessarily linear. The progress can be exponential because it's a self-fulfilling and self-driving, not self-driving, but I wouldn't even say self-perpetuating, but a self-feeding cycle. Someone had a question?
Is the space that you create, is that the same, or can you categorize that through bittul? Like, is that like...
When you say the space that you create inside the dough?
No, like with the hay and the chaz.
Oh, yes, 100%. That's exactly what it is.
Creating, like, that's like what happens when you bittul.
That's exactly what it is. And you know, I'm glad you said that, because I can't believe that I had this whole talk without mentioning that word, but that's exactly what bittul is, right? And this is where people go wrong, thinking that bittul means, oh, I'm nothing. It's like, what, you know better than Hashem? Oh, I don't matter, I'm not important. You know better than Hashem? It doesn't sound like bittul to me, right? Bittul means having an accurately informed perspective. That's what bittul is. And what's Chabad? The whole Chabad, what the Alter Rebbe talks about bittul, right? And this is a very common mistake that probably anyone who takes Chassidus seriously is going to make at some point in their journey, which is, bittul is good, let me be mevatel myself, let me minimize myself. Doesn't say anything about that anywhere in Tanya. What is the Alter Rebbe's approach? It is Chabad. Exactly, which means that the way that real, truly valuable, sustainable outcomes are achieved always starts with our head. Learn, understand, increase your clarity. As our perspective becomes more accurately informed, what happens? Our awareness and appreciation of Hashem increases. What happens? Our self-centeredness naturally will recede. So there's no action of the pursuit of bittul, trying to become bottle, is by definition inherently self-defeating, because trying to become bottle is the antithesis of bittul. I want to be bottle. What's the first word in the sentence? I. Bittul is not achieved by pursuing bittul. Bittul is a natural outcome that emerges from an accurately informed perspective of reality. And that's what everything starts with Chabad. Avas Hashem, a true, real, human, experiential feeling of love towards Hashem. It's only ever going to be real we could say that we love Hashem and we can convince ourselves that we love Hashem. We're only ever actually going to feel a real human emotion of love for Hashem if Hashem is somewhat real to us. So we can't go out for coffee. How are we supposed to get to know Hashem? You get to know Hashem by learning about Hashem. Right? And you can get to know Hashem academically, that's Chachma and Bina. And then Das is, okay, now work to allow that to become real for yourself. It's not just information, it's part of your experience. Das is that bridge. And as soon as we have that understanding, and then integration of that understanding, and now this is our reality, as our perspective and perception of reality becomes more accurately informed, our love and awe of Hashem will increase, and our yeshus will decrease, i.e., we've become more bottle.
Right. I have another follow-up question.
So just let me tie that in to here. So yes, that's exactly what that whole is. Because as our perspective becomes more accurately informed, we focus more and more on Hashem and on the bigger picture. Naturally, there's just not as much focusing on ourselves anymore. So we see things more objectively. We're more and more okay with looking at ourselves objectively, and more interested in doing something about it. So yes, bittul is that opening that allows the negativity to make its way out.
Okay.
Now, you had another question?
Yeah. So like whenever people are, there's so many people who do so many great things, or even just like on a daily basis here in Mahon, like we'll give each other compliments, or we'll talk about each other in good ways, and then usually like what I see or pick up on is that, we're quick to kind of like not want to take in like a compliment, like it's like, oh, no, or something. But it's like, would a higher form of that, like with Bittul, or like a shliach who's doing so much and is trying to be so humble, like just to like accept it, but to say like, thank you and Baruch Hashem. Like, thank you for saying that, but Baruch Hashem, like, everything that you see that you're complimenting me on, it's not me, it's from Hashem. Like, would that be a higher form of, like, somebody who's grounded with that, perspective, that's, like, open to the fact that like it's not me, like it's all from Hashem?
I don't think it's a yes or no situation, but the point that you're getting at is very valid. Now, let me see if I can clarify what I mean by that. I'm already out of time officially. A lot of times when someone's like, oh, it's nothing, don't worry, I would guess, without having any data or anything, probably the overwhelming majority of the times when someone says that, it's not coming from a healthy place. Either it could be actual arrogance of like, I don't want people to think I'm arrogant and I want to appear better than that, so I'm going to put it down. Sometimes people are just, the self-esteem or whatever it is, they're uncomfortable with that, and so they're, oh, it's nothing. That's not bittul. It's a separate thing, and I could talk about that for 7 hours. Bittul means an accurately informed perspective, and I'll do the right thing for the right reason, right? And let me give you an example, a personal story. I remember as a bachar on Mivtzoim, I'd visit people to put on tefillin, and I remember one time I walked into a man's office, and he was like, oh, Rabbi, please come sit in my chair. And my natural reflexive reaction that I felt inside was, oh, no. Like, you don't have to give me your chair, you're older than me, I look up to you as an older person. But Baruch Hashem, I had the clarity to stop and ask myself, is he offering me the chair because of me? No. He's offering the chair to what I represent. I am here as a shliach of the Rebbe. I represent Hashem. I represent Torah and mitzvahs in his experience and in what I'm doing here. And so he's offering me a chair as a representative of Hashem, of the Rebbe, of Torah and mitzvahs. And so I said thank you and graciously accepted the seat. Because I was doing so on behalf of Hashem and the Rebbe and Torah and mitzvahs. Right? So now I wouldn't say that that's a higher level of bittul necessarily. Because there is a time and a place to accept a compliment, but what bittul means doing things for the right reason, motivated by the objective truth of the bigger picture and Hashem and the role I play in that. Sometimes, depending on who's giving the compliment and why they're giving it, and how they perceive me, and how they perceive the compliment that they're giving me, right? Sometimes in accepting someone's compliment, it can be, first of all, it could be disrespectful, it could be just not nice. And sometimes it could be the right thing to do, right? It depends. Because it's not about the compliment, it's about, what bittul means is everything ultimately is about the objective truth of the bigger picture, not about me. Sometimes the right thing to do from bittul will be to accept it, and sometimes it will be to minimize it. I think that the vast majority, if not almost always, and maybe always, probably not always, but a lot of the time, minimizing compliments probably comes from a place of negativity or not quite ideal health or security or self-esteem. Probably almost all the time. But you know what? I remember in my personal journey, there was a person who always, whenever I would thank him or something like that, he was like, oh, I'm just a representative of the Rebbe. And he said it in a very wholesome, grounded way, and it taught me that, yes, I'm here to do things and to make a real difference and to help people and to have an impact as a representative of the Rebbe, as a representative of Hashem. He wasn't like, oh, don't thank me, it's nothing. But he was also saying, look, ultimately, this is not about me, it's about the Rebbe. Right? So there is a time and a place to accept compliments. There's a time and a place perhaps to minimize them in a certain way. But ultimately what bittul is not about yes compliment or no compliment, it's about where's it coming from and why. And then we make the best decision we can on the circumstances.
How do you find the middle ground?
I don't know if it's necessarily about middle ground per se, because it's not like, oh, there's a middle ground that's always the right place. It's about making the best decision that we can make in a given circumstance. How do we do that perfectly? We don't. We do the best that we can, and we learn, and we sometimes will look back and say, maybe I could have done better, and I'll try to do better next time. But it's not about middle ground. Bittul is about doing what needs to be done for the right reason in the moment, which sometimes will be one thing, sometimes it'll be something else. Sometimes it's kindness, sometimes it's strength. Have a good one.